Hi, everybody, and welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. I am so glad and honored on this episode to be talking with comics creator, comics mastermind. May I say comics mastermind? Is that a
I
thing?
I have not been called a mastermind today, so that's I'll take that. Is there like a step ladder below that, like maybe not quite the top mastermind, but maybe in between.
There's
So
always a master and an apprentice. I know this from Star
sure.
Wars, so that's probably the case.
Yeah, fair enough. And I will say this: even when you get to be the top of your game, top of the company, everybody has a boss. Sooner or later, everybody realizes everyone has a boss.
That's true. That is true. The corporate world. But I haven't said your name yet, so I will say Greg Goldstein. Welcome. Welcome, sir.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I am enjoying the art on the wall behind you currently,
Okay.
enjoying that from here, and appreciate what you do in the world of comics and all of the projects that you've worked on. So we can sort of take a little walk through the annals of time here. And I'm curious, by means of a first question, what have comics allowed you to do creatively?
I think it's a great. I think it's a great question. I'm a visual thinker, and I think visually, and I think I didn't obviously as a little kid reading comic books, I didn't really know how to interpret or understand that, but I think I just tend to think in terms of visuals, and I've always been interested in art. I've always been interested in photography. And so comics have allowed me to kind of, in one way or another, even at a macro level, express myself visually and work obviously with some of the greatest, storytellers in terms of visual storytellers um, that are on the planet.
Mhm, mhm. Uh,
So
th- oh, sorry.
no, I know. I was just going to say. So it's allowed me, sort of the things that I'm interested in and the things that I've enjoyed. It's allowed me to participate in them, which is terrific.
Just thinking about the number of properties that you've been part of that are also filmic. So curious about, are you a film lover as well?
Yes, I am. I'm a film buff. I actually thought about working in the film business, and I've sort of dipped my toes in places there along the way. But I kept coming back to publishing. So yeah, I am definitely a film person. When I talk about comic book storytelling, I typically compare it to film. So,
Yeah,
and I'm sure I'm not the only one.
yeah, yeah. There is just something about the written word, the printed page, or the digital page, and I appreciate that as well. And you get to be in control as a reader a little bit more than in a film where you're sort of strapped in a way.
That's true. That's a good, it's a really good point. You can pace yourself, and some comics, which are brilliant comics, are tend to be simple visually, and that's fine. And you don't need necessarily a lot of time to absorb everything. But if you're, reading a graphic novel by Mobius,
Hmm.
you probably want to spend a little bit of time with each page and try not to miss anything.
True.
Even though you may try not to miss anything, you probably miss something.
Yeah, yeah. Now you've worked in the worlds of things like Star Wars, Transformers, some of the big properties.
Yeah.
You also were part of the creative scene behind the book March as well, if I'm not mistaken.
It's true. I can't take much of the credit for the creative part of March. I can certainly take credit for making sure that the books got the distribution and marketing and support that they deserved.
Hmm.
Um, that was really the brainchild of, in addition to the creators, Chris Staros at Top Shelf. And the first volume of March had actually been published when we acquired IDW, when we acquired Top Shelf.
Hmm.
So the trick was to, help shepherd two and three out, as well as, kind of make sure that March one was always in print. Once three was completed, make sure there was always a box set volume of all three volumes. And it's one of the books that were all of us that were associated with management at IDW and Top Shelf at the time. It's obviously one of the books we're most proud of because it's a terrific book. And a perfect example of what happens when a great visual storyteller, in this case, Nate Powell,
Hmm.
gets a hold of a really interesting story that is John Lewis's story as written by associate of John's, Andrew Aden. And again, but it's Nate's visuals that make that so compelling. Of
Yeah,
course, the
yeah.
story. I mean, it starts with the actual story of John Lewis nearly being murdered on the Selma Bridge, but and events before that in the civil rights movement.
Yeah, that visual rendering is really powerful in that story, and even down to the lettering, the use of shadow, the way those pages come together, it's really quite striking in a way.
It is, and it's funny that you should bring up March because I was in a conversation yesterday about black and white comics, and my it really depends on the artist whether or not I think the um, black and white could be as effective, if not more, than color. And Nate's an example of somebody, you didn't need to add duotone shading. You didn't need to do, Nate understood how to use tone and wash and things and a good sense of shadows and light, which is so important.
Hmm. Curious about the role that you take there, the sort of the approach that you take in that role of shepherding books and what that's like on the editorial side for you.
Well, when you have a sort of publishing role and you wear many hats, right? I mean, you depending on the size of the company, you're your own gopher at some point because that's just sort of the nature of the beast. But anyone who's in charge of creative product, and applies to comics or outside, is essentially just making sure that the pieces fit together in a way that makes sense. And in TV nowadays, they call that person the showrunner. That's the sort of executive producer who's like keeping an eye on the writer's room, not necessarily writing the scripts or even taking a direct creative role, but just helping keep things organized. I think the success of the earliest Marvel comics were Stan Lee, for better or worse, kind of being the mastermind of what was going on in the Marvel universe. And um, uh, again, when I said for better or worse, I was thinking of Stan in two regards. I was thinking of him as writer slash editor, and then I was thinking of him as editor slash editorial director.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think there's a lot of controversy about what Stan wrote and what Stan didn't write. But at the end of the day, he, without ever knowing what that title was, because it pre-existed that period, or sorry, post-existed that period, he was the showrunner of the Marvel universe.
Yeah.
And much as today, Kevin Feige is the showrunner of the MCU cinematic universe. And, that seems to have really worked for a really long time. And I know there have been some stumbles that people have talked about recently. But essentially, it's essentially any managerial role like that is just making sure the pieces come together. And I was fortunate both at Topps and at IDW to have great editorial talent to work directly with the writers and artists constantly to make sure things were working. And they don't always work. They don't, and when they don't, it's sometimes the person in my role has to make the tough choice that we need to change direction to make things work.
Yeah, yeah. And then you have diehard fans like me that are still, I still love the MCU and the Marvels and all that stuff too. So,
Yeah, look, listen, I can actually be very objective. I think I guess that sounds kind of self-serving. I can be objective. I really am objective, honestly.
mhm, mhm.
Um,
I believe you.
but uh, there's only been a handful of the Marvel movies and TV shows that I actually just didn't like, and it just so happens a couple of them were just recently. The Marvels was included. I was just kind of like, okay, that would have been a good season two of the TV show, I think, as opposed to a film.
Yeah,
I think their struggles, and again, an outsider looking in, I think some of their struggles are trying to figure out what's TV content and what's movie content and how to make them distinct.
yeah, yeah. And an interesting time to deal with those questions too.
Yeah.
A very interesting time.
Yes.
Um, so you mentioned Nate Powell and Andrew Aden. I'm curious also about some of the other collaborations that have been especially positive over the years, including maybe folks that you've kind of had that shepherding role with, as well as the role of collaborator, sort of peer to peer.
Well, I mean, there are some, I've got there are so many creators I've worked with where I feel so fortunate that you go from one extreme to somebody like Darwin Cook, the late Darwin Cook, unfortunately.
Hmm. Hmm.
And Darwin did the Parker series for us and his friend Scott Dunbier, editor at IDW, and those Parker graphic novels were basically just giving Darwin the source material and just getting out of his way. And he loved the source. It was really, this was a chicken or egg classic situation. Darwin loved the Parker novels, which were written by Don Westlake using the pseudonym Richard Stark, for those that don't know. And he came to Scott and IDW and said, "Would you guys get the rights to do this? Because I really want to sink my teeth into it."
Hmm.
And fortunately they were available and we were able to do it. And again, you stay out of Darwin's way, and you get an unbelievable result. And there's one guy doing everything, and that goes so underappreciated because he's adapting the material, which is hard work in its own right. He's penciling, he's inking, he's choosing the colors for each of the novels in terms of sort of a duotone mood that he's setting up for the story. He's doing the lettering, and he won a couple of awards for just the lettering.
Hmm.
He's doing the design of the book. I mean, like I said, the smart thing to do there is, stay out of the way.
Right, right.
And then you have a more traditional license project, going all the way back to my days at Topps and the first Jurassic Park adaptation, which, was primed to be a bit, it was Spielberg doing the kinds of things he had done in the past, and everybody was kind of hoping it was, kind of a return to form of these big summer blockbusters that he could do, because there have been a couple of, I think I might have my timing slightly off, but I think the last movie he did before Jurassic was Hook. And I
Hmm.
think
That sounds about right.
I think he wanted to, he certainly wanted to make people forget that, and it's Universal and Amblin and everyone else did. So, I mean, from Jurassic, the studio was very invested in what we were going to do. And Jim Salicrup, our editor, really needed to put together a top creative team, which ended up being Walter Simonson and Gil Kane and George Perez.
Hmm. Hmm.
Each, Walter loves dinosaurs and has written some terrific adaptation material. Gil certainly was no stranger to either adaptations or penciling in a hurry and redoing things if he had to,
Hmm.
which with licensed material you often, especially things on a movie schedule, you often end up doing. And then George was thrilled to ink Gil. So, I
Yeah.
mean, it was one of those, you put the pieces together, and again, working with, I'm all of a sudden I'm the halfway point between the studio and the creative team, and just trying to make sure somehow all those books got out the door, not only in those days in the direct market, but they had to hit certain newsstand dates.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
everything was that was a wild ride. And it's the 30th anniversary of those books this year. And so I've been asked a lot of questions about it. And I've loved the first Jurassic Park movie for the most part.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, and that adaptation, it stands up and is just a wonderful book and wonderful take in its own right, even apart from the film.
Yes, and it's fun though. The fun thing to do, hindsight's always 2020, right? Is go back and read the Jurassic Park comics as comics,
Hmm.
because you'll see when you compare it to the film, as opposed to reading it as the trade, you compare it to the film, all like it's unbalanced because of approvals and what the studio wanted to release and what they didn't. So almost all the dino action happens at the very end of 3 and the beginning and the entire issue 4. It's the 4-issue series is not structured the way the film was, because the Spielberg and the rest of the Universal team kind of, again, didn't want to release a cat out of the bag before the film appeared. It's funny how that's evolved. I mean, there's a whole separate subject, but it's funny how that's evolved over time,
Hmm.
because George Lucas's own adaptation of Star Wars, a paperback novelization, which he did with Alan Dean Foster, I think, if I remember correctly. But I do know this: it was out well before the movie was out. It was actually a bestseller, which is
Yeah.
wild. So you want to know what was going to happen in Star Wars, you just could go buy the book, and certainly the first couple issues of the comic were out too.
Yeah, yeah. And I was always one of those readers who I would read the book, read the comic, see the film, read the books again. So it totally worked for me in that
Yeah.
way as well.
Yeah, and again, it's hard in 2023 to think about this. I'm friends with Howard Chaykin, who drew the first adaptation and of the Star Wars film, and
Mhm.
Howard is very self-critical of his work on, again, working under deadline pressures, having to make changes, not having access to all the reference material when would have been appropriate.
Mhm.
Um, and so it's kind of interesting to sit with him at a convention and hear his reaction to them, when people bring books over to sign and whatnot. But that, like, if you couldn't get to the movies, if you didn't, and I got my driver's license that summer, but if you couldn't get to the movies on your own and you had to wait for your parents to be willing to take you yet again to see Star Wars,
Yeah.
something like a Star Wars comic, that was the way there was no video. Home video was 6, 7 years away of being really relevant at that point. And so nowadays, it's like, oh, the movie's been out 90 days. I can watch it on streaming and VOD. And you're
Yeah.
like, but no, that was, and those books were so reprinted, just over and over in different formats. And it was really, but that's how we kind of looked at Star Wars again, that and the trading cards.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which you knew well as someone who worked at Tops, I'm sure as well.
Yeah. I mean, look, I've, some people would say this is going to be a very apt statement, but I've gotten to be 12 years old my whole career. I got trading cards and comic books and video games. I mean, what,
It's a beautiful
it's
thing.
little toys and some entertainment and other things thrown in for good measure. But yeah, those three have been the main thrust.
Love it. Love it. Well, that brings us to our last official question, and then we can also throw in anything that we might have missed. I've
Sure.
not been sort of looking at the list necessarily, and that is the creative direction moving forward. What currently has your creative wheels turning, and where can folks learn more about that?
So I've been spending my time as not CEO of something and not running something. I've been spending more time getting interested in the original art of comic books, which, as you
Mhm.
pointed out earlier, you can see some of it on my wall. This is something I'm going to turn this desk around because the better wall is behind the computer.
Nice, nice.
But so I've been writing a blog about sort of original comic art, the relationship between the art itself, the story, sometimes my personal relationship between the art. I've been putting that on a blog. I've been doing that for a few years, and now I'm ready to evolve that into something else, and I just haven't quite figured out. I've got a couple of ideas I'm toying with for 24, just sort of to see where that might lead me. But I'm, again, going back to sort of the early conversation. I'm a visual thinker, and although it turns out I have a slight learning disability that prevents me from being able to draw well, at least up here, I'm thinking about things visually. So I'm very interested in all the great comic book artists, past and present. So we're going to do. I've helped a few creators and something I call comicsnomics, which is kind of just helping people navigate the field of what it's like to be in economics of if you're on the comic book creation side. That's been a little bit more interesting to me as a late career professional than as opposed to all the things I've done in the past. It's just sort of like, oh, I can help people maybe just sort of navigate the occasionally or sometimes often rough seas.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a very kind thing as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I know it's cliche. It's a way of giving back and just I I understand it's tremendous amount of talent. There's probably more talent out there now, than there ever has been, because one of the positives of technology and social media is the fact that you could be a little kid, teenager, young adult, mid-career adult in the middle of the country and not have access to comic book shows and not be able to physically meet editors. And you could be drawing samples and tweeting them out. And
Mhm.
somebody can see them and go, holy cow, this guy's perfect. Let's hire him for this film noir thing that we're doing.
True,
And
very true.
so, people have access because, again, if you go back to even the 70s when I was very young and collecting and getting involved in comic books retail, basically the publishers were going to two shows. They were going to the big New York Comic Con. Most of the publishers were in New York, if not all of them. And then there was usually some sort of presence in San Diego by the mid 70s, late 70s. But I always wonder about talent that never made it into the field because no one ever saw their work.
Yeah, very true. And what a great use of social media. It's been used in many ways, but what a great use to share art and connect with folks in that way.
Yeah, and I've seen it. I follow, I have a weird mix on my social media of things that I follow, but I do follow a lot of comic book related sites and people. And I have seen it where it's clearly someone's contacted someone and said, "Hey, would you like a tryout? Would you like a gig?" And
Mhm.
I think that's great. And if I was, this has changed a lot, even I think since the pandemic, when people were stuck, there were no conventions. People were stuck at home.
Yeah.
If you weren't using an online digital social media presence, you were alone basically because
Mhm.
you couldn't go anywhere. So so I've seen a tremendous amount of new talent just kind of pop up that way, and it just it sort of makes me think. Even at IDW, it would have been interesting to kind of make sure, as part of editorial duties, if editors had to spend at least an hour just kind of like, for lack of a better word, trolling, but trolling for a good purpose,
Mhm.
looking for new talent or looking for maybe underutilized talent.
Yeah, I think that was part of Zoe Thorogood's path in the industry too, and
I, I,
she
I
just
think
won
that's right.
the like whatever the award is for the newcomer
Right.
in at the San Diego.
Right.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, because you've got, I mean, that's one positive is that there's more access. And then the other positive is that in the aggregate, worldwide, more people are reading the graphic novel slash comic book form than probably ever.
Hmm.
The challenge is that's all inclusive. That's Scholastic's Dogman books. That's manga. That's European adult albums. That's really encompasses everything. But people are much more comfortable with the idea of the sort of the visual comic book language than they were when it was primarily superheroes and primarily kids.
Hmm. Hmm. True. It's a good time for the medium in many ways.
Yeah, it is. And since this is a limited time podcast, we don't have to talk about the downside of that.
Sure,
I want to
absolutely.
talk about the positives.
Yeah. Well, did we miss anything?
Oh,
Speaking of the time
well,
and such.
I'll throw that back at you. Did we miss anything?
I think we got the major notes on the list, I believe, and glad to share about your work and career, and glad to talk again anytime if there is something that you'd like to throw out
Sure,
into the world.
that would be great. And I guess if there was one sort of final note, if you will, it's just
Mhm.
it's interesting when someone like me who had difficulty actually drawing with a pencil or a pen or what have you, but was able to kind of find my way into visual businesses like comic books and trading cards and video games. I mean, it's what's going on. It's can you be creative up here? Can you work with people? Can you kind of put teams together? And again, and Darwin's obviously not the only one. There are many other projects where you just stay out of the way. You just go, oh wow, this guy's or gal is super suited for doing this kinds of things. That was a great um that was one of the terrific things at IDW is we were really good at licensed comics. We had some terrific creator-owned projects, but we didn't really have good access to the indie world until we acquired Top Shelf, and then we kind of
Mhm.
that really kind of completed the portfolio. Well, maybe not complete's a little aggressive, but it basically balanced the portfolio
Yeah,
and
yeah.
gave us access to a lot of good creators who they might take a lot longer, but they will, they really want to sort of be the master of their own kingdom and kind of create everything from soup to nuts. And some of that work is, obviously terrific.
Yeah, absolutely.
Plus we got a little bit of Alan Moore for good measure too.
It's a good thing. You can't complain about that.
There you go.
Well, Greg, thank you so much for the time, and once more, glad to have you back anytime to talk about the world of comics. And I'll also make sure to link your blog in a nice pop-up for the video, as well as the show notes for the audio.
Thanks, Jason. I appreciate that. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Love what you do, and hope you do many, many more.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thanks for the support and the time.
Great. Thanks.